Alright folks, I want to welcome everybody to this video. Today is December 8th, 2020 here in the Philippines. And folks, I'm just going to talk about just an informal history of what happened here in the Philippines during World War II. Everybody obviously knows about Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, 1941. But what most people don't know is that there was a sort of an equal Pearl Harbor that happened over here at Clark Field, which is Angeles City. Now, in the background here, you're looking at the beautiful Subic Bay. So I'm not in Angeles City, I'm not at Clark, but I'm going to talk about the raid on Clark and talk about a little bit about what happened here at Subic Bay. And folks, by no means have I thoroughly researched this. I've done studies in the past where I thoroughly researched events and I was a subject matter expert. If you want to know anything about the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, I researched that to the hilt. And that goes through going through all types of sources all the way to the Library of Congress, and I would consider myself a subject matter expert on My Lai. I am by no means a subject matter expert on the historical events that happened here on Subic Bay or over at Clark or here on the Bataan Peninsula. You're familiar with in America we say the Bataan Death March. Over here people pronounce it Bataan in my experience. But just south of here is the Bataan Peninsula, where all the forces were backed up to, and eventually some of them went to Corregidor before Corregidor fell. Alright, so what I'm going to do, just to try to make this sort of an interesting learning experience to maybe challenge you to go out and do more research on your own, is I'm just going to talk about the raid on Clark, and there's 2 or 3 personal stories about people who were at Clark, and I'm just going to read their personal stories. And no thank you, darling. No mango girl. I'm going to read their personal stories from articles that I just found online and I found interesting, and I'm going to share them with you. Now, it's a windy day here on Subic Bay, so if there's a little bit of wind noise, you just got to deal with it. Yeah, I'm not perfectly in focus, but you know what? You can look at the beautiful palm leaves and the floating bar, Subic Bay, and some mountains over there. That's looking over towards Hanjin, and then I've got QB Point over to my right shoulder here. So it's just an informal talk. So if you're not interested in history, you're probably not going to be interested in this video. But if you just you're driving down the road, just hit play and listen to my voice, because the scenery is not going to change. This is more of a podcast. Okay, so let's just go back, and I'm going to breeze over this stuff. I'm going to use Wikipedia. I realize Wikipedia is not always on time, but it's a good just base to start your research out from there. So while, like I said, everybody knows about Pearl Harbor, but let me just start out on Wikipedia, and we'll take it from there. So Manila was a U.S. forward military base in the Pacific with strategic significance comparable to Singapore for the British Empire. Lieutenant General Douglas MacArthur commanded U.S. Army forces in the Far East from headquarters in Manila. Okay, his command included ground forces and the Far East Air Force. Clark Field was the primary air base for the bombers, expected to provide offensive airstrike capability under the Rainbow 5 war plan. And fighter aircraft expected to provide defensive cover could use Clark or satellite airfields, including Nichols Field, Nielsen Field to the southeast, and Iba Airfield to the west, and Del Carmen Airfield to the south. Far East Air Forces also protected Naval Base Cavite, serving as the home port for the cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and flying boats of the Asiatic Fleet. Alright, and again folks, if any of this stuff is incorrect, please put it down in the comments. All I'm doing is providing a base for discussion. The Far East Air Force, with headquarters at Nielsen Field, was under the command of Major General Lewis H. Brereton. I hope I said your name properly. I hope I said that name properly. I'm assuming Major General Brereton has passed away. May he rest in peace. Now, he was required to report to MacArthur through MacArthur's Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Richard K. Sutherland. Okay, so at the time of the attack on Clark Field, the Far East Air Force had more planes than the Hawaiian Department protecting Pearl Harbor. A fleet of 35 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers was the largest number assigned to any Army Air Force. Clark Field was the primary base for the B-17s, where these heavy planes were stored without camouflage on ramps, lest they become stuck in the undrained soft soil surrounding the graded surfaces. The B-17s could also use Del Monte Airfield in southern Mindanao, where military personnel lived and worked in tents on a pineapple plantation. Aircraft at Del Monte were beyond the range of land-based Japanese bombers, but were similarly unable to reach Japanese targets. So they were down there in Mindanao, they were safe, but they couldn't just take off and hit Japanese targets. They're too far away. In addition to the B-17s, on 8th December included 107 Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighters, 26 Seversky P-35 fighters, 18 Douglas P-18 Bolo bombers, 12 Boeing P-26 Pea Shooter fighters, 11 Curtiss O-52 Owl observation planes, 2 Douglas O-46 observation planes, 8 North American A-27 ground attack aircraft, and 3 Martin B-10 bombers. So obviously they had a lot of aircraft. All right, fast forward to the events of 8 December 1941. Now this is UTC plus 8 here in the Philippines. What's that stand for? Universal Time Coordinated. So we're going off local time here. And again, if these timelines, if you don't agree with this, put your own timeline down in the comments. I don't trust Wikipedia 100%. But again, they're just a good place to start with, you know, to start the research. 0240, Asiatic Fleet Headquarters received notification of the Pearl Harbor attack, but did not inform MacArthur. All right, so let's just pause on that for a second. You have a major attack going on. Obviously, the United States is under this surprise attack. Why would you not notify everybody? Now, folks, we're going to see a chain of events in this Clark Airfield attack. It's similar to the Pearl Harbor attack. And you can just, you know, it's a number of factors, but it's the mindset of just being lackadaisical. We're not at war. People going on about their merry business. So at 0240, they knew, but they didn't tell MacArthur. 0340, Sutherland heard a commercial radio broadcast with news of the Pearl Harbor attack and notified MacArthur. So we've already got this breakdown of communication of, I think it's fucking important information, that General MacArthur knew that we were going to war, right? Why wouldn't they notify everybody? So this guy, Sutherland, hears it on a commercial radio broadcast, but waits another 20 minutes to notify the Far East Air Force headquarters of the attack. Okay, go ahead to 05. Sutherland refused Brereton's request to launch a B-17 raid on Formosa from Clark shortly after daylight. Now, Formosa is Taiwan, right? What we call Taiwan, Formosa, which is in striking distance to Clark Airfield. So Sutherland requests, hey, in accordance with the Rainbow 5 operation plan, I'm requesting permission to launch a B-17 raid on Formosa. Sutherland refused. They agreed to prepare for a mission preceded by a photo reconnaissance mission, but to await MacArthur's permission for the offensive operations. Now, folks, okay, obviously you have to have a command and control, but these are major blunders because it takes too long. It takes too long to make a decision at that level. Look at the invasion of Normandy on D-Day. Okay, we the Allies were able to land on the beaches of Normandy basically because Hitler, was such a control freak at that point that he was the only one who could release certain units. And so that breakdown, that quagmire, that backlog in decision making allows people attacking. It just allows them time. And so it worked against the Nazis on D-Day, and here it is working against the commander over here at Clark, trying to do what's already planned. And sure enough, that's where they're launching some of these. That's where they're launching the attack from, is Formosa. So he gets denied. The guy says, okay, send a photo reconnaissance mission over there. Well, okay, at least you're doing something, but guess what? You're just buying the attackers more time. 0530. A War Department message reached MacArthur's headquarters confirming war status with Japan, requiring Rainbow 5 planned air raids against Japanese targets within range of the Philippines. 6:15. MacArthur's staff received notification of Japanese aircraft attack on Davao Field, Mindanao. 7:15. Sutherland refused to allow Brereton to speak with MacArthur and directed him to await orders. What are you waiting on, bro? What are you waiting on? Okay, we're under attack. There is a Rainbow 5 war plan. That a message comes from the War Department confirming war status with Japan, requiring air raids. So this guy Sutherland, it sounds like he's one of those sergeant safety types, afraid to grab a fucking set of balls and make a decision. And I don't want to hang him out to dry because I don't know the whole story, but just being an outside observer looking at this, this guy was part of the problem. He wasn't the only problem, but he was a part of the problem. Afraid to make a fucking decision, afraid to pull the fucking trigger when A, you're under attack, B, the War Department is directing you to implement the war plan, and you're still denying this guy Brereton to launch these attacks. So here's what you have. Here's what you have: people going around, jumping the chain, jumping down the chain, but they're making sense. So at 08, General Henry H. Arnold called from Washington, D.C., warning Brereton not to let his planes be attacked on the ground. Okay, I get it. You're sitting there in D.C. and you're looking at it, and you get this dude on the phone and say, hey, motherfucker, don't let them planes be decimated like our ships just got decimated in Pearl Harbor. Take some fucking action. Don't let them come in there and just fucking pick them off left and right. I can understand that, but what did he do? He circumvented the chain of command. He was up here. He just bypassed MacArthur and Sutherland, all these other people, went straight down and called the airfield and said, motherfucker, don't let them planes get taken out on the ground. Okay, so 30 minutes later, poor old Brereton, getting fucking, just beat up by all sides. He knows what to do, it sounds like. He's ready to do what needs to be done, but people are just fucking with him from left and right. His folks in Manila are telling him one thing. He's got DC calling him, telling him to do another. So what's he do? Obviously, you don't want to piss off DC. So at 8:30, Brereton launched 3 squadron-sized fighter patrols and all serviceable B-17s from Clark Field. They went aloft into a holding pattern. Okay, so what's he do? He complies with what DC called him and told him to do, right? Don't let them fighters and them bombers get just tore up on the runway. So he launches them, puts them in a holding pattern. Because this poor dude knows what the Rainbow 5 war plan is. He's supposed to start hitting fucking targets in Formosa. But he got denied. You know, DC calling saying, don't let him get hit on the ground. So I kind of put myself in his shoes and say, well, the safest thing to do would have been to get all those bombers en route to Mindanao and out of reach of the Japanese strike. It would have been out of their striking distance. But Brereton is thinking, I don't need to send them down to the Val because the war plan calls for us to arm these motherfuckers and go to war and start bombing people. So I understand, at least in my mind, why he didn't send them south and get them out of harm's way. In hindsight, that would have been the safest thing at that time because he didn't have enough time. But initially, this guy is thinking, hey, all I'm doing is putting these things in a holding pattern until this jackass Sutherland and MacArthur approve what is already fucking SOP anyhow, and then I gotta fucking land them, refuel, arm these guys, and get these B-17s en route to Formosa. So he puts them in a holding pattern. 0850. So 20 minutes later, after he puts them in a holding pattern, he calls Sutherland again requesting permission to launch a raid on Formosa and was told to wait. Told to wait. You know, these higher level commanders, a lot of times, they're so goddamn afraid to fucking make a decision. They just tell you to wait, and you sit there and you wait and wait and wait until the situation just gets worse and worse and worse. And then they're gonna fucking blame it on that ground commander. The people sitting up there in DC, they're not taking the fucking heat. It's always the people on the ground, the captain of the ship, and all the people sitting up in the Ivy League Tower. They're not gonna take any heat for it. So the worst thing you can do is get told to wait when you know what has to be done. All they're doing is fucking burning up time, making it worse for you. It's gonna cause more casualties, but that's what he gets told. Hey motherfucker, wait. He's got a plane in a holding pattern, and he's told to wait. 0925. Japanese 5th Air Group bombers from Formosa bombed Tuguegarao Field and the summer headquarters up at Baguio. Now, if you're not familiar, Tuguegarao is up on the northern sort of, I don't know if you'd say central, I'm not looking at a map, but I've been to Tuguegarao. That's where Pablo's pig farm was. So they bombed Tuguegarao on the northern part of Luzon, and then they bombed the vacation station up there in Baguio. That's at 9:25. Brereton telephoned Sutherland and was refused permission to launch an offensive strike. And if you believe this timeline, you got poor old Brereton over there just fucking itching to do what's right and itching to go to war. And he keeps calling this pussy Sutherland and keeps getting shot down. And folks, if I'm way off base, it's because I have not done all the research. But from this timeline, if that timeline is anywhere near accurate, Sutherland was the fucking, he was the roadblock. (0930). 11th Air Fleet of 26 Mitsubishi G3M bombers, 82 Mitsubishi G4M bombers, and 84 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters took off from where? From Formosa. Okay. Now, I don't know if Brereton, even if from the onset, would have had enough time to arm, fuel, get those bombers en route. Maybe from the minute the first bomb started dropping on Pearl Harbor, he would have had enough time to strike Formosa before they launched all this wave of attack at 0930. I don't know. You know, most things in the military move so fucking slow, especially this was before wartime. They weren't ready. But maybe he would have had enough time to do some damage. Alright, so at 9:30, here comes the attack. 9:40, Sutherland gives Brereton authorization to launch the photo reconnaissance mission. Fucking Sutherland. Motherfucker, an attack is already underway because of your inaction, and now you're sending a motherfucker over to take pictures. By the time they get there, they're gonna be taking pictures of an empty fucking airfield because the fucking bombers are already on the way. You see the pattern here? Inaction. Inaction. Nobody got a set of fucking balls. It looks like this gentleman Sutherland had no balls. 10:14, here comes MacArthur with a set of balls. Gives Brereton authorization for an airstrike. So at least we got some fucking action going down. Alright, let me pause it for a second because my wife here is bothering me while I'm making this historical video. So the wind is picked up. I'm not sure if this whole video is going to be so windy. I got this thing on this badass tripod and the wind is just whipping it. Maybe this was similar weather back in 1941, I don't know. But there we go, 10:14, MacArthur grabs a set of balls, gives Brereton authorization for an airstrike on Formosa. Unbeknownst to them, it's too late. The wave of attack is already en route. So at 10:30, the planes that got launched at 8:30, who were in this holding pattern, okay, because DC called, basically went from the chain of command up here, jumped MacArthur and all these people, went straight down and said, hey, put them in the air. So he put them in the air. At 10:30, the planes that were launched at 8:30 landed to be refueled. They've been fucking in a holding pattern for 2 hours. So they land to be refueled. At 10:45, Brereton orders the B-17s that are landing at Clark to be armed with 100-pound and 300-pound bombs, anticipating a launch at 1400, that's 2 p.m., for an attack on southern Formosa airfields at dusk. So basically they would have launched at 2, got over there and hit them around, 7 o'clock, 1900. 11:30. Okay, so the planes landed at 10:30 to get refueled, but at 11:30, Iberville radar detected the incoming 11th Air Fleet 130 miles out, 210 kilometers. 11:45 a.m. Iberville and Clarkfield began launching fighters to intercept the raid. At 12 noon, Clarkfield received warning of the approaching airstrike. 12:10, cameras for the photo reconnaissance mission arrived at Clark to be loaded onto the B-17s. Folks, you see the craziness and just the ridiculousness. When bombs are dropping down on Pearl Harbor, it's not time to take pictures. It's not time to take pictures. Okay, we're already at war, and now this dude wants to send some fucking cameras over to take pictures. No balls. No fucking balls. Inaction. Sergeant safety. Pussy. Should never have been in that position. It's apparent. But we all know people in the military who are in those positions with no fucking balls. They got there from licking ass and sucking somebody's asshole, and they shouldn't be in those positions. We're at war. People have already died. Bombs have already dropped, and you want to take fucking photos? There's already an op plan, dude. It's already been ordered to implement it. We don't need to take fucking pictures, Mr. Sutherland. 12:35. Clarkfield was launching reserve fighters as the 11th Air Fleet began an hour-long bombing and strafing of Clarkfield and Iberville. I don't know if you say Iba or Eba. I've heard people say it both ways. Air raid at 12:35 p.m. A horizontal bombing run at 20,000 feet, 6,100 meters by 26 Mitsubishi G3M bombers and 27 G4M bombers released 636 60-kilo bombs. That's 130 pounds. So they let loose with 636 135-pound bombs over Clark Field. My goodness. The planes were above the range of Clark Field anti-aircraft guns, And as the bombers departed, 34 Mitsubishi A6 Mike Zero fighters strafed undamaged planes on the ground at Clark Field. 7 minutes later, 53 Mitsubishi G4M bombers dropped 486 130-pound bombs and 26 550-pound bombs on Iba Field, followed by 51 strafing Mitsubishi A6 M0 fighters. The destruction at Iba Field was so complete that the Zeros flew on to Clark Field to find targets for their remaining ammunition. So here's the results. Of the 17 B-17s on the ground, 12 were destroyed, 4 were damaged, and 1 escaped damage. 2 evaded damage while on the recon missions and returned after the raid. They made it because they were over there fucking taking pictures, wasting time. So 11 B-17s have been flown down to Mindanao before the raid, and 5 more reached there on the day of the attack. The P-40 fighters that were in the air were unable to reach the altitude of the Japanese bombers and suffered a poor exchange rate and low altitude combat with the strafing Zero fighters. 34 P-40s were destroyed on the ground or in aerial combat. Man, that wind is whipping. The older P-35 and P-26 fighters were obsolete for air-to-air combat, but were used for training. They might have been useful for observation and ground attack had they survived until the invasion. So here's the aftermath. United States Army Air Forces Commanding General Henry H. Arnold called Brereton that afternoon to ask how the hell he was caught by surprise 9 hours after receiving news of the Pearl Harbor attack. There you go. Another classic example of all the motherfuckers sitting up in Washington, D.C. War Department. All these motherfuckers sitting up there shielded. And they can just call down and ask this poor fucking ground commander, the dude on the ground getting fucking bombed, how he fucked up. And what's he gonna say? Hey, I called this pussy Sutherland a million fucking times requesting permission to go to war, and he told me to wait. He told me to wait, he told me to wait, then he told me to go take fucking pictures. What's he gonna do? Everybody knows how it is in the military, right? You get up to the fucking ivory tower, you're immune to getting prosecuted or fucking demoted or whatever. Most of the time, they're just gonna hang us poor bastards out. Poor motherfuckers from the backwoods of Mississippi, that's who they hang out to dry down on the ground. Walter Short was relieved of command of the Hawaiian Department on 17 December by Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall, who took no similar action against MacArthur despite remarking to a reporter a few days later, "I just don't know how MacArthur happened to let his planes get caught on the ground." This article don't say shit about what happened to Sutherland. But maybe that's a big complicated picture that basically is similar to what happened at Pearl Harbor. There were so many warning signs. Now look, I'm not going to go into the theory and the facts that are present that say, you know, the United States government knew this shit was coming. They had to let it happen to where the American people would be behind getting into World War II. Let's not go down that road. Let's just stay on the track of what happened in a military historical sense, if this is anywhere near correct. All right. This is another article that talks about it, but basically in the end, let's see, Walter D. Edmonds, it doesn't say his rank, summarized the disaster. In the Philippines, the personnel of our armed forces, almost without exception, failed to assess accurately the weight, speed, and efficiency of the Japanese Air Force. He quoted Major General Emmett O'Donnell Jr., then a major in charge of the B-17 sent to Mindanao. as concluding that the first day was a disorganized business and that no one was really at fault because no one was geared for war. Well, I understand it in both ways. Okay, A, we know how the military acts during peacetime, right? During peacetime in garrison, it's sergeant safety. Sergeant safety's at the helm. But in the same sense, when you're in the military, you should always be fucking geared for war. So that's a goddamn cop-out. The culture of being in garrison and sergeant safety, you know, make sure you wear your fucking iPro while you're walking around the base, stupid shit like that. Make sure you wear your glow belt. That's the culture. And then that's why you get caught with your pants down when you start taking fucking indirect fire. People start coming over the goddamn wall. Alright, so let's go to a couple of stories. And this one here, there's a couple articles that basically says, you know, Pearl Harbor wasn't... Fucking laptop just died. Damn it. I gotta find a place to plug this bitch in. Ooh, there we go right there. I'll be right back with you. My MacBook Pro battery is going down. Look at all the Apple products I've ever bought. This MacBook Pro from a couple years ago has been the only one that's sort of let me down. I mean, I had a MacBook Air. That damn thing, couldn't kill it. I finally killed it like 10 years after I bought it at a bar because I spilled a beer on it. But this MacBook Pro from a couple years ago, it's got a shitty keyboard. Now the battery doesn't work right. Only Apple product that's ever kind of been a lemon. Anyhow, Pearl Harbor wasn't the only surprise attack that day, and this is on military.com, and it was written December 7th, 2013 by a gentleman named Steve Campbell. So I want to give credit to him. I'll put the link down in the description. But I found it to be a pretty interesting article. The December 7th, 1941 surprise attack on Pearl Harbor is burned into the American consciousness. But for two North Texans, December 8th is the day they will never forget. And that's 79 years ago today. Just hours after the dawn attack on Pearl Harbor, but across the international date line, making it December 8th, Japanese planes also bombed American bases in Manila and the Philippines. It was a complete surprise. We were unprepared. It was the second of a number of Pearl Harbors in that first year of the war, said Leon Long, a 93-year-old who grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin and then joined his high school friend George Loritz in the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1939. The two pals who worked in aircraft maintenance were stationed at Clark Field with the 19th Bombardment Group, composed of 35 B-17 bombers and 23 P-40 interceptors. Just days before, 16 B-17s were flown 500 miles south to the island of Mindanao as a precaution against attack, Long said. After hearing radio news reports of the Pearl Harbor attack early that morning, Long and Loritz were returning to work after lunch when they saw two flights of more than 50 twin-engine planes approaching the airfield. George said, "Hey, look, it's nice to see the Navy is out protecting us." About that time, the earth began to erupt at the end of the runway, Long said. George ran to the hangar where he worked and I dived into a slit trench. Two other guys jumped in on top of me, he said. After enduring nearly an hour of bombing and strafing runs that destroyed 16 of the B-17s and 20 of the P-40s and most of the base, Long crawled out from beneath the other two men who had been killed by concussion blasts to find that Loritz was among the 100 Air Corps troops killed that day. So that's pretty eerie right there. The only reason that guy survived is because two guys jumped in on top of him and their bodies shielded him, took the brunt of the concussion. So just imagine him on the bottom with two on top, stacked up like firewood, and he survived and they didn't. That day was just the beginning of a remarkable year-long odyssey of war for Long as he escaped the Philippines and joined other survivors of his bomber group in striking back against the Japanese. A family in war. 40 miles away near Manila, then 9-year-old Elsie Miller was dressed and ready for a big day, her first communion in the Catholic Church, when her father, Edward Normandy, an American Transportation Company executive, rushed home after the Japanese attacked Manila. Normandy had served in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War and then stayed in the Pacific and married Isabel Halili, a Filipino. She died shortly after Elsie, their 10th child, was born. Normandy appeased his daughter by making a quick trip to the church and then packed her and 7 other siblings off to safety in the countryside. Elsie's 2 oldest brothers stayed with their father, and they joined Filipino and American troops in the determined but doomed fight for the Philippines against overwhelming Japanese forces. The 8 other children stayed with relatives who owned fish farms, and eventually they scattered in pairs before returning to Manila during the Japanese occupation, Miller said. It was a struggle. There was never enough food. It was terrifying. The Japanese were raping women and killing babies, said Miller, now 82 and living in Granbury. The U.S.-Filipino resistance in the Philippines lasted until April 9, 1942, when U.S. General Edward P. King surrendered to the Japanese. About 12,000 Americans and 63,000 Filipinos who had been pushed back onto the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island became prisoners of war and were subjected to the infamous Bataan Death March. The Japanese forced the already weakened prisoners to march 65 miles to a prison camp. Guards shot any man who failed or faltered during the 5-day march. Along the way, the Japanese singled out prisoners, sometimes in groups, and shot them to death as examples to the others. Between 7,000 and 10,000 men were killed, but Elsie's 61-year-old father and 2 brothers survived. The 2 brothers eventually escaped from the Japanese. The older brother, Edward Normandy Jr., a doctor who worked at a hospital in Manila, organized a clandestine intelligence unit. He was seized by the Japanese shortly before American forces liberated Manila and was tortured and killed, Miller said. Miller's father remained a captive for 4 years. The Americans liberated the few skeletons left in Bataan, and my father was one of them. At his age, I don't know how he survived, Miller said. After the war, Normandy returned to work for the transportation company and later bought a plantation in the Philippines. He died at 77 in 1961 in Maryland and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Miller moved to the U.S. to attend college. In 1961, she was among the first members of the Peace Corps to serve overseas. She went on to work for the Peace Corps for nearly 20 years and retired to Granbury in 1996. Okay, now back to Clark Field. A repair and an escape. By the time Japan surrendered in the Philippines, 2/3 of the Americans captured at Bataan had died in Japanese custody. A lucky break allowed Leon Long to escape the island. About 10 days after Clark Field was bombed, Long was transferred to an artillery battalion on Bataan. One night, after spending a day digging gun pits in the rain, he crawled under a chicken coop to sleep. During the night, somebody kicked me in the butt and told me to get my rear end in a Jeep. You're going back to Clark Field, Long said. The few B-17s that were intact after the Japanese attack had been sent to safety in Australia. But a crew from a bomber with a large hole and a fuel tank were desperate to escape, and someone remembered Long's metalworking skills. Long's tools, which had been buried to keep them from the Japanese, were dug up, and he cut the top off of a 50-gallon drum and screwed the metal patch over the gaping hole with a seal improvised from a tire tube. It worked. The B-17 crew taxied down about 100 yards and then stopped. A guy came running back and said that since I fixed the tank, the pilot wanted me to come aboard. That's how I got out of the Philippines. I would have never made it through the Bataan Death March. So folks, what a story. What a story. This guy digging gun pits on Bataan. Eventually he would have been either killed or rounded up for the Bataan Death March. But thanks to this B-17 that had a hole in the gas tank and he was a metal worker. He went over there and fixed that hole in that gas tank, saved the day. And then that crew said, hell no, bro, you're coming with us. You're the reason that we're getting out of here. Because if that B-17 hadn't taken off, those pilots and that crew, those crew members probably would have been on that death march as well. So thanks to him patching the hole, allowing them to get out of Clark, they said, hell no, bro, you're coming with us, and that's what saved them. There would be no shortage of challenges before he made it back home. Stationed first in Australia, and then at a base in Java, and then pushed back to Australia. His unit was first attached to Dutch, then Australian, and finally British Air Forces. There were no replacements available for bomber crews, and Long was soon pressed into duty as a side gunner on a B-17. After bombing missions, he went back to work repairing the planes. The first time I ever fired a 50 caliber machine gun was in combat. You learn rapidly in that situation, Long said. His well-traveled unit finally rejoined the Army Air Corps, and late in 1942 his group returned to the U.S. Our ship landed in San Francisco, and me and a friend slipped away and spent 4 or 5 days in the St. Francis Hotel. We were the first troops back. You couldn't buy a drink or a meal, he said. Long spent the last 3 years of the war training bomber crews at Peyote Air Force Station in West Texas, spent another 20 years in the Air Force, retired as a master sergeant, spent 27 years in research and engineering for General Dynamics in Fort Worth. So, the story is just about his life, but Tom Clark, a 68-year-old former jet fighter pilot during the Vietnam War who worked with Long at General Dynamics, said his story from the Philippines amazes him. He said, I worked for him for years before I heard anything about the war. His escape from the Philippines, that's one of those deals in life I call a God wink. It's so incredible you have to think something's behind it. So that's just a story of a gentleman who was on Clark. That day when the bombs started raining down, and just kind of crazy that thanks to his metalworking skills, that's how he survived. And he's probably being honest. I mean, you don't know till you're there in the mix, but according to him, he never would have made it through that battalion death march. So that B-17 with that hole, the irony is that's what saved him. All right, let's talk a little bit about Subic Bay. I'll just start here in the middle of this article. The 4th Marine Regiment, which had been withdrawn from Shanghai in China. Now, if you know anything about 4th Marines, they're known as the China Marines. They were ordered to withdraw to the Philippines. The first members of the regiment disembarked from President Madison at Subic Bay early on the morning of 1 November 1941. The remainder arrived on 1 December. The Marines were housed in temporary wooden barracks and in tents at the naval station and the rifle range. The freshly arrived Marines were assigned to provide land defense for Subic Bay. Seaward defenses included the batteries at Fort Went on Grande Island, which I don't know if you'll be able to see it in the distance. No, I think it's actually blocked by the bar, but anyhow, Grande Island's right behind me. And a minefield which had been laid off the entrance to Subic Harbor. As the Marines built beach defenses, consolidated Catalinas, which were stationed at Subic Bay, were conducting daily patrols off Luzon as a response to rumors that the Japanese were approaching the Philippines. On 11 December, 7 Catalinas had just returned from patrol when Japanese Zeros appeared and strafed the aircraft. One ensign was killed and all Catalinas sank to the bottom of Subic Bay's inner basin. As the Japanese continued their advance through Luzon, telephone and telegraph lines between Manila and Olongapo were sabotaged. As a result, all Japanese in Olongapo were rounded up and turned over to the provost marshal. A priest had also been questioning Marines and Filipinos about sensitive matters such as troop positions and strength, and after the Marines became suspicious, a search of the priest's belongings was ordered and a shortwave radio was found. Right there and then, the battalion commander convened a hearing, and after intense interrogation, the priest confessed to being a member of the German-American Bund and had been a spy for the Japanese. He was then taken behind the church and shot by a Marine firing squad. By 24 December, the situation at Subic had become hopeless, and an order to destroy the station and withdraw was given. All buildings on the station were torched, while Filipinos burned the entire town of Olongapo. All that remained on Subic was the former New York, and she was towed into a deep part of the bay and scuttled. All Marines withdrew to Bataan and eventually to Corregidor, where they made their last stand. Fort Went, under the command of Colonel Napoleon Boudreau of the U.S. Army, was evacuated on 25 December. All equipment and supplies were destroyed. On 10 January 1942, soldiers of the Japanese Imperial Army's 14th Infantry Division marched into Olongapo, and on 12 January, the Japanese commandeered native fishing boats to seize Grande Island. Subic Bay Naval Station was established with 4 companies of soldiers and a company of, Kempeitai. Within 1 week of the Japanese occupation of Subic Bay and Grande Island, American PT boats at Cavite were ordered to attack a Japanese ship which was anchored at Subic Bay that was shelling American positions. PT-31 and PT-34 entered the bay separately. PT-31 suffered engine trouble and ran aground on a reef. She was abandoned and destroyed. PT-34 entered undetected and sunk a 5,000 long ton transport that was offloading supplies. She then came under heavy fire but managed to escape undamaged. PT-32 was then ordered into Subic Bay and attacked and hit a light cruiser on 1 February. On 17 February, PT-34 made a final but unsuccessful attack at Subic Bay, after which all PT boats were ordered to leave the Philippines. To protect Subic Bay, the Japanese garrisoned Fort Went with anti-aircraft artillery and automatic weapons, but did not repair the American guns nor build permanent fortification. The Japanese then started shipbuilding at Subic Bay and began constructing wooden auxiliary vessels. Several hundred workers from occupied China and Formosa were brought in as laborers, in addition to 1,000 Filipinos. 9 ships were built and shipped to Cavite for engine installation. However, none of the ships would see active service as they were destroyed by U.S. Navy aircraft. Thank you very much, Dawn. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, I'm still working on this. Thank you so much. One of the few buildings that were left standing from the bombing and subsequent torching of the station was the Catholic Church. The Japanese removed all religious articles and converted it into a movie theater, and was later used to imprison Americans and Filipinos that had been captured. Those who died were buried behind the church in a common cemetery. When all the prisoners were shipped to Manila, the Japanese used the church as a stable for horses. 20 October 1944, 4 U.S. Army divisions aboard 650 United States Navy vessels landed at Palo Leyte, fulfilling MacArthur's promise to return to the Philippines. On 13 December, the Japanese began evacuating civilians and non-essentials from Manila aboard the Oryoku Maru and 4 other merchant ships. As the ship was heading for Japan, fighter aircraft from the aircraft carrier Hornet attacked the ships and left hundreds of Japanese dead or wounded. Oryoku Maru, heavily damaged and destroyed steering gear, pulled into Subic Bay. Throughout the night, the Japanese disembarked while the American and Allied prisoners that were carried below decks were left aboard. The next morning, Japanese guards ordered the prisoners to come up on deck. As Navy aircraft began to strafe the ships, the prisoners started frantically running about. As the pilots approached, they recognized the white shapes as Americans or Allies and sharply pulled up, rocking their wings in recognition. After, the 1,360 surviving Allied prisoners were forced to strip and swim ashore, where they were crowded into a fenced tennis court near the Spanish Gate. Early the next morning, 3 fighters scored 2 direct hits on Orinoco Maru as she burst into flames. After burning for 2 hours, she settled into the water about 100 yards off a lava pier. When the planes had left, the Japanese served the prisoners their first meal since leaving Manila 2 days before. 2 teaspoons of dry, raw rice. There was only one faucet from which the water trickled out so slowly that a prisoner was lucky if he managed 1 drink every 18 hours. Roll call was taken every morning, and those who had died during the night were buried in an improvised cemetery next to the seawall. After 4 days at Subic, only 450 survived the makeshift prison. They were subsequently sent to the labor camps in Japan. By January 45, the Japanese had all but abandoned Subic Bay, and the U.S. 5th Air Force had dropped 175 tons of bombs on Grande Island, invoking only light fire from the skeleton Japanese force manning the anti-aircraft guns. The commander of Japanese forces in the Philippines, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, had withdrawn his forces into defensive mountain positions and ordered Colonel Nagayoshi to block Highway 7 near Subic Bay. 29 January, 40,000 American troops of the 38th Division and 34th Regimental Combat Teams came ashore without resistance in San Antonio, Zambales, which is just north of here, by the site of what became known as the San Miguel Naval Communications Station. Column advanced towards Subic Bay, meeting their first resistance at the bridge spanning the Calaclan River near the Olongapo Cemetery. The Japanese, knowing that they would imminently lose the town, decided to destroy Olongapo. Eventually they evacuated and the 34th Regiment took over. The following day, Grande Island was taken, and Navy minesweepers began clearing the bay. Engineers of the 38th Division remained in Olongapo to begin reactivation of Subic Bay Naval Station. Bridges, buildings, and the water distilling plant were repaired, and the beaches and streets were cleared. Soon enough, LSTs were making dry ramp landings near the town of Subic. And folks, there's you a little bit of history of what went down here in the Philippines just hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which was, December 8th here. Clark Air Base got bombed. I don't have all the answers. I'm not a subject matter expert in the local history. I should be visiting more of these historical sites and getting more first-hand knowledge and talking to people here. I hear a lot of interesting stories from you guys that were stationed here in the 70s, 80s. I hear a lot of interesting stories from you guys who were here when Pinatubo blew. But I think, for the average Americans, they've heard of the Bataan Death March, they've heard of Corregidor, but the average American can't tell you shit about it, especially today's generation. They don't, it's just no emphasis in it. But Clark Field was basically another Pearl Harbor. Got caught with her pants down, and they basically took everything out on the ground unopposed for the most part. So complacency kills. I mean, that's an old saying. Law enforcement and the military. Folks, I don't know if that was interesting or not. I had some more articles to read, but when I start reading these long things, I lose my voice. I mean, one of the hardest jobs I think that you can do is be a teacher. When you have multiple classes a day and you have to stand in front of a class and teach students, number one, you're standing. Number two, you're talking. you're moving around, and by the end of the day, you know, I don't think I've ever been as tired as I've been when I got done with a day of teaching. Now, talking to this camera, I'm just sitting here drinking beer. It's not a comparison. But once I talk for an hour, my voice is like gone. So anyhow, I hope you guys learned something. I hope that my mango lays. I hope that maybe that you take a moment to do some research, read a few articles about what went down. You know, that was like the last great generation. As me and my friends, you know, we talk about, you know, for the older guys, our father's generation. For me, it's my grandfather's generation. That was like the last great generation. Was the people who fought in World War II. Not taking anything away from anybody else who's fought in any other war, but I think anybody will admit that you know, World War II was the closest thing to fucking hell on earth. So anyhow, I'm sitting here on Subic Bay. Just figured I'd take a moment to reflect on everybody who lost their lives in World War II. You know, it don't matter what country you're from, you know, locals here, local Filipinos, Americans, you know, now our Japanese friends. But it's just funny how history just comes in these cycles, you know, where back during that time the Japanese were considered enemy, and now some of the nicest people I know are Japanese folks. And I guess that's the importance of not forgetting history, so we don't allow it to repeat itself. So take a moment, reflect, do your own independent research, leave a comment down below if I totally fucked up that timeline based off of just, you know, Dr. Google research here. I'm admitting to you that I didn't do proper research. But if I invoked thought or made you Google, you know, Subic Bay World War II or Clark Airfield World War II or the Bataan Death March, well, guess what? I invoked thought. I caused you to go out and do some independent research, and mission accomplished. Oh, we'll talk about one more thing about 4th Marines. You know, 4th Marines are known as the China Marines. And I want you to do your own research, but I'm just going to say this. Okay, the unofficial story behind the 4th Marines, that they're unofficially known as the only Marine Corps unit to ever surrender. And I guess if you dig into the history, they didn't technically surrender. It was the general down in Corregidor Island. It was an army general who surrendered, but they were there on Corregidor. But they're known as, you know, kind of like on the street as the only Marine Corps unit to ever surrender. And unofficially, the flag can never return to U.S. soil. That's why it's planted on Okinawa, and the battalions are split up among other units. So research that. There's history, a lot of history behind 4th Marines, but they were here in Subic Bay. And shout out to all my buddies at 1-4. Just do your research. It's just interesting history. You know, I'm not saying anything positive or negative, I'm just telling you what history, what the rumor is, what the legend is. I'd say it's more legend. It's more of a legend. But they were here at Subic, got pushed down into the Bataan Peninsula, got pushed to Corregidor, where everybody was forced to surrender. They were part of that group. Anyhow, folks, shout out to everybody at 1-4. Their motto is whatever it takes. Badass motto. Folks, if you're not a subscriber on my channel, bottom right hand corner of your screen, somewhere right there, just hit that Overstay Road sign. Get on board my train. Food, beer, visas, bad behavior, barbecue. Sometimes I like to talk about history. And believe it or not, sometimes I'll read the Bible. I do what the hell I want to do. Ain't no niche here on this channel. just sharing a slice of my life, living on the Overstay Road. Folks, I'll see you guys on the next one. May everybody who lost their lives in that conflict on this day 79 years ago, everybody that's ever participated, lost their life in any war really, but I'm reflecting on 79 years ago, December 8th, 1941. Today is December 8th, 2020, and I'm here on Subic Bay, you know, in the vicinity where the hostilities kicked off. You know, just kind of eerie to think 79 years ago. 79 years ago. You can't see it for the bar here. You know, there was battles going on, bombs falling from the air 79 years ago. Kind of crazy, you know. If you're over at Clark, just take a look at Clark Field and imagine 79 years ago there was what, like almost 1,000 bombs rained down on that fucking runway, on that base. Holy shit. I'll see you on the next one, folks. Peace out.